One moment, the universe is collapsing into silence. Heroes who fought across galaxies reach out with trembling hands as friends dissolve into drifting ash. The sky darkens beneath impossible defeat, and for the first time in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, hope itself seems to vanish. Avengers Infinity War ends not with celebration, but with absence. Half of all life is gone. The audience leaves carrying the emotional weight of an ending that feels almost unbearable. Then, without warning, Marvel cuts away from cosmic devastation to something almost laughably ordinary. A quiet suburban house, an ankle monitor. Scott Lang sits under house arrest, tapping away on a digital drum kit with the enthusiasm of someone determined to keep boredom from winning. When his daughter Cassie visits, cardboard boxes become elaborate mazes, living rooms transform into playgrounds, and every spare moment becomes another excuse to invent a game. The tonal shift is so abrupt that it almost feels like another franchise entirely. Yet that very contrast reveals something fascinating. While audiences expected every Marvel film to become bigger, louder, and more apocalyptic, Ant-Man and the Wasp deliberately moved in the opposite direction. At first glance, that decision looked almost reckless. Releasing a modest heist comedy immediately after one of the bleakest superhero movies ever made seemed destined to disappoint viewers hungry for answers about Thanos and the fate of the vanished Avengers. Many questioned why Marvel would pause its biggest storyline just as the stakes had reached their highest point. But sometimes the smartest storytelling decision is refusing to chase escalation. Endless spectacle eventually loses its impact if every film insists on saving existence itself. Without moments of relief, even extraordinary events become emotionally exhausting. That is exactly where Ant-Man and the Wasp quietly succeeds. Instead of trying to outdo Infinity War, it shrinks the battlefield. The mission is personal rather than universal. The conflicts revolve around family, redemption, second chances, and impossible science instead of galactic extinction. The action unfolds through clever planning, improvisation, and playful visual imagination rather than armies crashing together across digital landscapes. By lowering the stakes, the film restores something surprisingly valuable: perspective. Scott Lang has never been defined by godlike strength or limitless ambition. He worries about being a good father before becoming a legendary hero. His victories often depend less on power than on creativity, empathy, and spectacular bad luck somehow turning into good fortune. That humanity becomes even more noticeable after Infinity War. When surrounded by stories of cosmic destiny, Scott's ordinary problems suddenly feel extraordinary because they remind us what the larger battle is actually protecting. There is a beautiful irony hidden beneath the comedy. The smallest heroes become responsible for preserving the emotional scale of the entire franchise. Without grounded stories like this, the Marvel Universe risks floating away into endless spectacle. Sometimes the greatest service a superhero film can perform is not expanding its universe, but reminding us why that universe matters in the first place. And in retrospect, that unexpected choice would become far more important than almost anyone realized. That unexpected shift in perspective is exactly why Ant-Man and the Wasp deserves a closer look. For years, it has existed in the shadow of the films surrounding it, remembered as the cheerful adventure squeezed between two universe-shattering Avengers epics. It is often treated like an entertaining detour, a pleasant pause before the real story resumes. But that reputation hides something far more interesting. Look beneath the shrinking suits, the jokes, and the elaborate chases, and the remarkably sophisticated piece of blockbuster filmmaking begins to emerge. This isn't simply a review of another Marvel sequel. It is an exploration of how director Peyton Reed quietly blended genres that rarely coexist so seamlessly. On the surface, the film is unmistakably a superhero adventure. Yet its heartbeat belongs just as much to romantic comedy, family drama, and classic caper cinema. Every chase is built like a heist. Every emotional beat depends on relationships rather than destiny. Even the comedy follows the rhythm of carefully timed slapstick, where size, space, and physical movement become punchlines as important as dialogue. That perspective changes how nearly every sequence is understood. Instead of asking whether the action is bigger than the previous Marvel film, we can ask whether it is more inventive. Instead of measuring power levels, we can examine precision, timing, and visual storytelling. The shrinking technology becomes more than a special effect. It becomes the language through which the entire film communicates surprise, suspense, and humor. A laboratory can become a suitcase. A toy can become a weapon. A city street can transform into an enormous obstacle course simply because the audience is constantly forced to rethink scale. Our journey through the film rests on three connected pillars. The first is its domestic stakes, exploring how family, responsibility, and love become more compelling than another battle for universal survival. The second is its visual mechanics, uncovering how Peyton Reed turns changing size into one of the MCU's most creative filmmaking tools through choreography, editing, and practical visual logic. The third is the quantum realm, a mysterious scientific frontier that initially appears to be little more than fascinating background mythology, but ultimately becomes one of the franchise's most consequential ideas. That final element may be the film's greatest sleight of hand. While audiences focused on giant pest dispensers, shrinking office buildings, and wonderfully chaotic chase scenes, the story quietly positioned a scientific concept that would reshape the future of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Long before audiences celebrated impossible time heists, this film had already placed the essential pieces on the board without drawing attention to them. Viewed through the traditions of slapstick masters and elegant caper films rather than conventional superhero spectacle, Ant-Man and the Wasp reveals an entirely different identity. Its greatest achievement is not overwhelming viewers with scale, but carefully arranging character, comedy, science, and narrative so that every seemingly modest choice supports something much larger. That hidden precision is why this overlooked sequel may represent Marvel's most refined structural storytelling at its peak. To fully appreciate what Ant-Man and the Wasp accomplished, it helps to remember what it felt like to be a Marvel fan during the summer of 2018. The excitement surrounding Phase 3 had reached an almost unimaginable level, but it came with an unusual emotional cost. Infinity War had left audiences carrying questions that refused to fade. Favorite heroes had disappeared in heartbreaking fashion. The villain had actually won, and every conversation seemed to circle back to one mystery. How could the Marvel Cinematic Universe possibly recover from this? For months, anticipation and uncertainty existed side by side, creating one of the franchise's most emotionally charged moments. Naturally, many viewers expected the next chapter to continue that same overwhelming momentum. Every trailer was examined for clues. Every frame inspired theories about the snap, the missing Avengers, and the inevitable rematch with Thanos. The assumption was simple. Every new Marvel release had become another piece of a gigantic cosmic puzzle. Yet when Ant-Man and the Wasp arrived, it seemed almost determined to ignore those expectations. Instead of opening another front in an intergalactic war, the story asked us to spend time with Scott Lang, a man whose greatest challenge was making it through the final days of house arrest without violating probations. His victories were measured in shared meals, bedtime games, and promises kept to his daughter. For Scott, being present for Cassie mattered just as much as wearing the Ant-Man suit. That perspective immediately made him different from many of Marvel's larger-than-life heroes. His motivation wasn't glory or destiny, it was family. That ordinary struggle gave the film an emotional honesty that felt surprisingly refreshing. Most people will never understand the burden of defending the universe, but almost everyone understands the fear of disappointing someone they love. Scott's balancing act between responsibility and heroism reflects a familiar reality. Life rarely waits until our personal problems are solved before demanding something more from us. The film embraces that truth with warmth instead of spectacle. There was also something quietly reassuring about returning to a world where conversations mattered as much as explosions and where success depended on cooperation rather than overwhelming force. The stakes were deeply personal but never insignificant. Saving one family could carry as much emotional weight as saving billions because the audience was invited to care about individuals before abstract numbers.
Looking back, that sense of comfort was exactly what many viewers needed, even if they didn't realize it at the time. After weeks of processing loss on a universal scale, Ant-Man and the Wasp reminded audiences why those larger battles mattered in the first place. Every galaxy, every city, and every timeline ultimately exists for people trying to protect the ordinary moments that define their lives. By focusing on one father determined to keep his promises while helping another family reunite, the film became more than a temporary distraction. It became an emotional reset, restoring the human heartbeat of the MCU before the saga expanded toward its most ambitious conclusion. Every film carries the weight of what came before it, but Ant-Man and the Wasp inherited something even more unusual. Before audiences ever watched Scott Lang shrink between cracks in the pavement or race across toy trains, the Ant-Man franchise had already become one of Marvel Studios' most complicated creative stories. The original film spent years in development, shaped by changing priorities, evolving plans for the expanding Marvel Cinematic Universe, and one of the most discussed creative departures in modern blockbuster filmmaking. By the time the sequel entered production, it faced an identity crisis that most franchises never experience. It wasn't enough to simply continue Scott Lang's story. The series needed to prove it possessed a voice capable of standing on its own. That challenge ultimately fell to director Peyton Reed. Having stepped into the first film under extraordinarily difficult circumstances, Reed entered the sequel with an opportunity he had never truly enjoyed before, the chance to define the franchise from the beginning of a production rather than inheriting one already in motion. The first Ant-Man naturally invited comparisons to ideas that had surrounded its lengthy development. The sequel, however, offered a clean creative slate. Instead of competing with expectations, Reed could concentrate on refining the qualities that had unexpectedly resonated with audiences: warmth, humor, inventive action, and an unmistakable sense of play. Rather than chasing a louder or darker tone simply because the Marvel Universe was becoming increasingly epic, Reed leaned into the series' unique personality. He understood that Ant-Man worked best when it celebrated contrast. Ordinary suburban neighborhoods became spectacular playgrounds. Everyday household objects transformed into instruments of action. Comedy existed alongside genuine emotional stakes without either undermining the other. This confidence gave the sequel an identity that felt increasingly distinct within a franchise filled with gods, super soldiers, and cosmic warriors. Perhaps the clearest expression of that confidence appears before the film even begins. The title itself tells an important story. Ant-Man and the Wasp was the first Marvel Cinematic Universe film to place a female superhero directly alongside its male counterpart in the headline. That small addition represented more than marketing. It announced a shift in narrative philosophy. Hope Van Dyne was no longer supporting Scott Lang's journey. She was sharing ownership of the story. That decision reflected the natural evolution established at the end of the first film. Hope had earned the Wasp suit through years of discipline, intelligence, and determination. Unlike Scott, whose charm often comes from improvisation and accidental success, Hope approaches every mission with precision and preparation. Their personalities create a dynamic built not on competition but on balance. Scott's instinctive creativity complements Hope's disciplined confidence, allowing each character to solve problems the other cannot. The sequel embraces that partnership rather than treating one hero as unquestionably more important. Evangeline Lilly became central to shaping that balance. She consistently emphasized that Hope should possess clear agency, emotional complexity, and meaningful influence over the story's direction. The screenplay responds by allowing her motivations to remain independent rather than existing solely in relation to Scott. Her determination to rescue Janet Van Dyne grows from years of loss, unanswered questions, and the hope that her family might finally become whole again. Those emotional foundations ensure that Hope's actions feel driven by deeply personal convictions instead of functioning merely as plot requirements. Paul Rudd brought an equally important ingredient from the opposite direction. His comedic instincts have always relied on authenticity rather than exaggerated performance. Scott Lang is funny because he reacts like an ordinary person placed inside extraordinary situations. His awkward pauses, uncertain confidence, and willingness to laugh at himself create humor that feels spontaneous instead of manufactured. Throughout development, Rudd's collaborative approach to character and dialogue helped preserve that relaxed humanity, ensuring the comedy emerged naturally from personality rather than interrupting the narrative with disconnected jokes. Blending that improvisational energy with a screenplay built around complicated quantum science presented its own creative challenge. The film constantly shifts between playful conversations about family dinners and dense discussions involving quantum tunnels, molecular instability, and dimensions beyond conventional physics. On paper, those elements could easily feel disconnected. Yet the screenplay consistently anchors its scientific concepts in emotional objectives. Every technological breakthrough exists because someone wants to reunite with family, protect a loved one, or repair a broken relationship. The science becomes meaningful because it always serves character before spectacle. That philosophy extends into nearly every relationship within the film. Scott and Hope continue discovering how trust functions under pressure. Hank Pym confronts decades of regret surrounding Janet's disappearance. Ghost's desperation grows from years of suffering that no one else fully understands. Even the supporting cast contributes to an atmosphere where personalities drive momentum more than explosions ever could. Instead of treating emotional beats as pauses between action scenes, the sequel allows them to generate the action itself. Looking back, Ant-Man and the Wasp represents the moment when this corner of the Marvel Cinematic Universe fully embraced its own identity. Peyton Reed stepped beyond the uncertainty surrounding the franchise's origins and crafted a film confident in its lighter tone, inventive visual language, and heartfelt relationships. By elevating Hope Van Dyne to genuine co-lead status while embracing Paul Rudd's effortlessly human comedic style, the sequel transformed what could have been a conventional follow-up into something far more distinctive. Its greatest production achievement was recognizing that the franchise's future would never depend on becoming bigger than every other Marvel story. It would depend on becoming unmistakably itself. By the time Ant-Man and the Wasp approached its July 2018 release, Marvel Studios found itself in a situation unlike anything it had experienced before. The Marvel Cinematic Universe had become more than a successful film franchise. It had evolved into an ongoing global event, with every trailer, casting announcement, and promotional interview dissected for hidden meaning. Audiences no longer viewed individual movies in isolation. Every release was treated as another chapter in a much larger narrative, and every chapter was expected to answer questions left behind by the last one. That expectation created an extraordinary challenge for a film whose greatest strength was deliberately telling a smaller story. The shadow cast by Avengers: Infinity War was impossible to ignore. Its ending had transformed anticipation into anxiety. Rather than leaving theaters excited about a traditional victory, audiences walked away processing defeat on a scale rarely seen in blockbuster filmmaking. Discussions across fan communities revolved around vanished heroes, impossible theories, and one overwhelming question: what happens next? In that atmosphere, almost every piece of marketing surrounding Ant-Man and the Wasp faced the same obstacle. Viewers wanted clues about the future, while the filmmakers wanted them to appreciate the present. One question quickly became unavoidable. If Scott Lang possessed technology capable of entering dimensions beyond conventional reality, then where had he been while Earth's greatest heroes were fighting Thanos? The idea spread rapidly because it sounded deceptively simple. Every interview seemed destined to include some variation of the same inquiry, and promotional material leaned into that curiosity without revealing its answer. Where were Ant-Man and the Wasp during Infinity War? Became less a criticism than a conversation starter, inviting speculation while carefully protecting the larger narrative still waiting to unfold. That balancing act required remarkable discipline. Revealing too much risked undermining future Marvel films, while revealing too little threatened to convince audiences that the movie lacked importance altogether. The marketing therefore focused on something different. Instead of promising universe-altering revelations, it highlighted personality, momentum, and inventive action. Shrinking cars, oversized PEZ dispensers, collapsing laboratories, and frantic pursuits across San Francisco communicated that this adventure would succeed through imagination rather than escalation. The campaign effectively shifted the conversation away from cosmic consequences and toward creative entertainment. Even the trailers reflected this philosophy. Rather than emphasizing one overwhelming antagonist, they introduced a constantly shifting web of competing objectives. Heroes, rivals, criminals, scientists, and mysterious strangers all appeared to be chasing the same prize for entirely different reasons. That structure immediately distinguished the film from many conventional superhero stories. Instead of building toward a single climactic confrontation between clearly defined good and evil, the narrative promised continuous movement, changing alliances, and unpredictable complications. Every faction possessed understandable motivations, creating tension that emerged from conflicting goals rather than absolute morality. This caper-inspired design became one of the film's strongest selling points. Chase movies thrive on momentum. Success depends on timing, geography, and improvisation instead of overwhelming force. Ant-Man and the Wasp embraced those traditions with enthusiasm, presenting action sequences that resembled elaborate games of pursuit more than military campaigns. Vehicles changed size in the middle of crowded streets. Everyday environments transformed into obstacle courses. Characters repeatedly gained temporary advantages only to lose them moments later as another group entered the race. The excitement came from constant evolution rather than simple domination. That emphasis on movement also helped separate the film from the emotional heaviness surrounding Infinity War. Audiences were not being asked to relive tragedy. They were being invited to enjoy clever choreography, fast dialogue, and visual invention without abandoning emotional investment altogether. It was an important distinction. Marvel understood that viewers did not necessarily need another devastating experience immediately after the previous one. Sometimes sustaining enthusiasm for a long-running franchise requires variety more than intensity. Expectation management became just as important as promotion itself. The studio never pretended that Ant-Man and the Wasp would immediately resolve the universe's biggest mysteries. Instead, it positioned the film as an opportunity to spend time with beloved characters whose adventures occupied a completely different emotional register. That honesty proved surprisingly effective because it allowed audiences to adjust their perspective before entering the theater. Rather than measuring the film against Infinity War's catastrophic scale, viewers could appreciate its humor, warmth, and inventiveness on their own terms. In retrospect, this strategy reveals a remarkable confidence in Marvel's long-term storytelling. Many franchises would have attempted to imitate the tone of their biggest success, assuming audiences always wanted more of the same. Marvel instead trusted that contrast could be just as valuable. By placing a nimble, character-driven chase adventure between two monumental ensemble spectacles, the studio protected its shared universe from creative monotony. Every film did not need to compete for the title of the biggest event because each served a different dramatic purpose. That confidence also reflected a deeper understanding of audience psychology. Constant escalation eventually creates diminishing returns. If every conflict threatens existence itself, viewers gradually lose their sense of proportion. Ant-Man and the Wasp quietly restored that balance. Its localized stakes, energetic pacing, and overlapping pursuits reminded audiences that excitement does not depend solely on destruction. Suspense can emerge from a stolen laboratory, a desperate rescue mission, or a race against time just as effectively as it can from the fate of the cosmos. Looking back, the pre-release landscape surrounding Ant-Man and the Wasp was almost as fascinating as the film itself. Trapped between the darkest ending Marvel had ever delivered and the promise of an even greater conclusion still to come, it could easily have been overshadowed. Instead, its marketing embraced curiosity without surrendering secrets, emphasized ingenuity over spectacle, and confidently presented a fast-moving caper where every character was chasing something different. In doing so, it reminded audiences that the Marvel Cinematic Universe was at its strongest not because every story looked the same, but because each one could find a fresh way to matter. The opening act of Ant-Man and the Wasp immediately establishes that Scott Lang's greatest challenge is no longer defeating impossible enemies. It is learning how to live with the consequences of his own choices. His decision to fight alongside Captain America in Civil War came from a sincere desire to help, but heroism rarely arrives without a price. Now confined to his home under federal house arrest, Scott exists in a strange limbo. He is neither an active Avenger nor an ordinary civilian. The film transforms that contradiction into the foundation of its storytelling, proving that limitations can be just as compelling as freedom. Rather than presenting confinement as relentless punishment, Peyton Reed fills Scott's daily routine with playful invention. Every corner of the house becomes evidence of someone determined to remain optimistic despite his circumstances. A drum kit offers temporary escape from boredom. Close-up magic tricks become an unlikely hobby. Basketball, electronic gadgets, improvised engineering projects, and endless experiments fill the empty hours. The production design quietly tells the audience everything they need to know. Scott is restless, creative, and endlessly resourceful. Even when trapped inside the same walls for years, he refuses to surrender his curiosity. That playful atmosphere reaches its emotional peak whenever Cassie Lang walks through the front door. Their relationship remains the emotional heartbeat of the franchise because it never depends on superhero spectacle. Instead, it grows through ordinary moments elevated by imagination. Together they transform cardboard boxes into elaborate labyrinths complete with moving obstacles, hidden passages, and tiny adventures. The maze becomes more than a charming visual gag. It reflects Scott's philosophy of fatherhood. He cannot give Cassie limitless freedom, but he can fill every available space with wonder. Cassie, in turn, never sees her father as a failed hero. She sees someone who keeps showing up. That distinction matters enormously. In a cinematic universe filled with legendary warriors and mythical figures, Scott's greatest accomplishment is earning the admiration of his daughter through patience, honesty, and affection. Their conversations feel effortless because they are built on mutual trust rather than dramatic exposition. The film understands that emotional investment comes from believable relationships, not simply high stakes. Even Scott's ankle monitor becomes part of the visual storytelling. It is a constant reminder that every action carries consequences. The device sits quietly in frame throughout countless scenes, rarely demanding attention yet always shaping Scott's behavior. Unlike many superhero restraints that exist only until the plot requires escape, this one influences every decision. Crossing the wrong boundary would destroy the normal life he has struggled so hard to rebuild. His prison is comfortable, but it remains a prison nonetheless. Outside those walls, life continues moving forward without him. Luis enthusiastically throws himself into the newly established ex-con security consultants, turning what once seemed like an unlikely dream into a legitimate business. Alongside Dave and Kurt, he approaches every opportunity with infectious optimism. Their scenes inject energy and humor, but they also perform an important narrative function. They demonstrate that Scott has something worth protecting beyond superhero identity. For perhaps the first time, he possesses the possibility of genuine stability. Luis, as always, remains the group's emotional accelerator. His unstoppable enthusiasm contrasts beautifully with Scott's cautious optimism. While Scott worries about finishing probation without incident, Luis imagines future contracts, expanding opportunities, and professional success. Their friendship continues working because it never feels transactional. Luis believes in Scott with absolute sincerity, creating a support system grounded in loyalty rather than obligation. The comedy emerging from these interactions feels effortless because every joke grows naturally from personality. Yet beneath that domestic comfort lies unresolved tension. Scott's involvement in Captain America: Civil War fractured his relationship with Hank Pym and Hope Van Dyne. From their perspective, Scott ignored explicit warnings and exposed advanced Pym technology to unwanted government attention. Years of secrecy suddenly collided with international politics, forcing Hank and Hope into hiding while Scott accepted a plea agreement that confined him to house arrest. Neither side is entirely wrong. Scott followed his conscience, while Hank and Hope dealt with the consequences. That fractured partnership adds emotional complexity to the opening act. Instead of beginning with a perfectly united team, the film introduces characters carrying disappointment, resentment, and lingering affection in equal measure. Hope remains frustrated by Scott's impulsive choices, yet traces of their connection survive beneath every conversation. Hank, meanwhile, retreats into his familiar mixture of brilliance and stubbornness, convinced that caution is always justified when revolutionary science is involved. Their emotional distance creates narrative momentum long before any physical threat emerges. The center of that hidden conflict is not simply a relationship but a machine. Hank and Hope have devoted years to constructing a portable laboratory unlike anything previously seen in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Inside this deceptively compact structure sits the quantum tunnel, a device designed to achieve what once appeared impossible, safely reaching the quantum realm and returning. The shrinking laboratory instantly communicates the playful genius of PIM technology. An object capable of rewriting scientific history can now be wheeled away like ordinary luggage, blending astonishing innovation with visual comedy. More importantly, the quantum tunnel transforms abstract scientific theory into deeply personal purpose. Hank has never accepted Janet Van Dyne's apparent death. Decades earlier, she disappeared into the quantum realm while saving millions of lives, leaving behind unanswered questions and an incomplete family. Every experiment, every calculation, and every sleepless night has been driven by one hope: that Janet may still exist somewhere beyond conventional reality. The machine therefore functions as far more than the film's central MacGuffin. It embodies grief refusing to surrender to certainty. Then comes the moment that quietly changes everything. Scott experiences a vivid dream unlike anything he has known before. Except it does not feel like imagination. Through an inexplicable connection, he perceives memories belonging to Janet herself, seeing fragments of her experience from within the quantum realm as though borrowing another person's consciousness. The sequence deliberately blurs the line between dream, memory, and quantum phenomenon, allowing uncertainty to become part of the mystery. Scott awakens confused but deeply unsettled, unable to dismiss what he has witnessed. That single experience becomes the story's true inciting incident because it transforms coincidence into possibility. If Scott can somehow connect with Janet across dimensions, then Hank's decades of hope may no longer be wishful thinking. Suddenly, every fractured relationship, every scientific breakthrough, and every personal sacrifice begins orbiting the same extraordinary question. The universe may have already provided the proof they never expected, and the quiet domestic life Scott fought so hard to preserve is about to become the center of an adventure that begins not with saving the world, but with bringing one family back together. Scott's dream refuses to remain just another strange memory. Before he can fully understand what happened, the ordinary rhythm of his final days under house arrest is shattered with remarkable efficiency. Hope Van Dyne appears without warning, effortlessly bypasses his carefully maintained routine, and removes him from the safety of his suburban prison. It is a wonderfully ironic beginning to the adventure. Scott has spent years avoiding even the smallest probation violation, only to be kidnapped by the very people he once considered teammates. The film immediately reminds us that normal life and superhero life can never remain separate for long. The reunion between Scott, Hope, and Hank is anything but sentimental. Their conversations carry the weight of unresolved disappointment, exposing emotional wounds that have not healed with time. Hope still struggles to forgive Scott for choosing Captain America's side without considering the consequences for their work. Hank, never particularly gifted at expressing vulnerability, masks lingering frustration beneath dry sarcasm and scientific focus. Scott, meanwhile, finds himself caught between apology and self-defense. He understands why they are angry, yet he also believes he acted according to his conscience. None of the characters are simplified into heroes or villains within their disagreement. Their fractured trust feels believable because every perspective contains genuine emotional truth. That tension gives their partnership new texture. Unlike many superhero teams that reunite after exchanging a few heartfelt words, this trio must rebuild cooperation while carrying unresolved resentment. Every decision becomes a negotiation. Every conversation reveals subtle shifts in loyalty and confidence. The chemistry works precisely because affection survives beneath frustration. These characters know each other well enough to argue honestly without completely abandoning one another. The reason for Scott's sudden return quickly becomes clear. His mysterious vision of Janet Van Dyne cannot be dismissed as an ordinary dream. Hank immediately recognizes details Scott should never have known, suggesting that some form of quantum entanglement has created an impossible connection across dimensions. Rather than relying on vague mystical explanations, the film treats the phenomenon as another scientific mystery waiting to be understood. Scott's memories may contain information capable of guiding Janet's rescue, turning him into an essential piece of a mission he never expected to join. This revelation also expands one of the sequel's most imaginative ideas. Shrinking technology is no longer limited to people and small objects. Peyton Reed dramatically increases the visual possibilities by allowing entire environments to change scale. The portable laboratory becomes the perfect demonstration of this evolution. What appears to be a sophisticated research facility can collapse into a rolling suitcase with the press of a button before expanding again into a fully functional headquarters. The concept is instantly delightful because it follows an internally consistent logic while remaining visually surprising. The shrinking laboratory also says something important about Hank Pym himself. His inventions never exist merely to impress the audience with futuristic engineering. They reflect an inventor obsessed with practicality. If a laboratory must constantly stay hidden from powerful enemies, then making it portable is not simply clever, it becomes essential. The technology solves narrative problems while simultaneously generating visual comedy, allowing science and entertainment to reinforce one another instead of competing for attention. This approach defines much of Ant-Man and the Wasp's visual identity. Scale is never treated as a single gimmick repeated endlessly. Instead, it becomes a storytelling language. Objects gain new meanings depending on their size. Everyday architecture transforms into portable equipment. Entire action sequences revolve around audiences continually reassessing physical space. The film understands that changing perspective is more engaging than merely changing dimensions. With Scott reluctantly drawn back into the mission, the search for a crucial quantum component leads the trio toward black market technology broker Sonny Birch. His introduction deliberately avoids presenting him as a world-ending criminal mastermind. Sonny represents a more grounded form of danger, opportunistic greed. He recognizes extraordinary inventions not as scientific breakthroughs capable of transforming humanity, but as products capable of generating unimaginable profit. That motivation fits perfectly within the film's smaller scale. The thread is not conquest but exploitation. The meeting unfolds inside a restaurant, where diplomacy quickly gives way to betrayal. At first, the exchange resembles a classic crime negotiation from an old caper film. Every participant believes they possess leverage, and every conversation conceals hidden intentions. Sonny's decision to manipulate the deal instantly exposes his true character. He sees Hank's technology as something to acquire rather than respect, underestimating the people standing across from him. What follows is one of the film's defining moments. Hope Van Dyne fully steps into her role as the Wasp, demonstrating exactly why the sequel deserved to place her name beside Scott's in the title. Her fighting style immediately distinguishes her from nearly every other Marvel hero. Where Scott often improvises through accidents and instinct, Hope operates with extraordinary precision. Every punch, aerial maneuver, wing-assisted movement, and perfectly timed size change reflects years of disciplined training. The choreography resembles an intricate dance, combining elegance with ruthless efficiency. The sequence also reveals Peyton Reed's growing confidence in visual mechanics. Shrinking is no longer reserved for isolated surprises. It becomes woven directly into combat itself. Hope changes size between attacks, alters momentum in midair, and uses shifting perspective to outmaneuver opponents before they can react. The action remains easy to follow because every movement obeys the film's established physical language. Creativity replaces brute force, making each encounter feel fresh rather than repetitive. Yet just as the heroes appear ready to regain control, the story introduces its true disruptive force. A mysterious masked figure materializes seemingly from nowhere, moving through walls, bullets, and solid matter as though conventional physics has ceased to exist. Ghost's arrival completely changes the rhythm of the scene. Up until this moment, every conflict has followed understandable rules based on shrinking technology and tactical planning. Suddenly those rules no longer apply. Ghost is fascinating precisely because she cannot be understood immediately. She does not behave like a traditional villain seeking domination or revenge through theatrical speeches. Instead, she appears focused, desperate, and intensely purposeful. Her intangible abilities create uncertainty unlike anything the heroes have previously encountered. Punches pass harmlessly through her body. Weapons become unreliable. Escape routes lose meaning when walls provide no obstacle. Every carefully designed strategy begins collapsing within seconds. More importantly, Ghost transforms the narrative from a straightforward recovery mission into a constantly shifting chase involving multiple competing factions. Hank's team wants to rescue Janet. Sonny wants revolutionary technology. Ghost wants something entirely different, though her motives remain hidden beneath mystery. From this point forward, no single conflict can be solved in isolation because every decision immediately affects someone else's objective. It is an elegant escalation. Rather than increasing the scale of destruction, the film increases the complexity of pursuit. Every new player changes the direction of the story. Every invention becomes more valuable, and every alliance grows increasingly fragile. By the end of this opening movement, Ant-Man and the Wasp has fully embraced its identity as a kinetic caper where science, family, comedy, and suspense are all racing toward the same destination, while no one yet realizes just how interconnected their paths truly are. With Ghost's arrival, the film abandons the simplicity of a single objective and transforms into a beautifully orchestrated pursuit where every character is chasing something different. From this point onward, Ant-Man and the Wasp behaves less like a conventional superhero adventure and more like an old-fashioned caper, where timing matters more than brute strength and every successful escape creates an even greater complication. The heroes are no longer solving one problem at a time. They are constantly reacting to 3 different threats, each operating according to its own logic. The first is the most ordinary and, in many ways, the most amusing. The FBI remains convinced that Scott Lang will finish his house arrest without incident, and Agent Jimmy Woo is determined to make sure that happens. Unlike the costumed adversaries surrounding the story, Jimmy is simply doing his job. He is not driven by revenge or personal ambition. His responsibility is enforcing the law, which creates an entertaining contrast with Scott's increasingly impossible situation. Every unexpected visitor, every unexplained absence, and every suspicious coincidence threatens to expose Scott's double life just days before his freedom is finally within reach. Jimmy Woo's presence also injects a refreshing sense of realism into the narrative. In another film, federal investigators might become faceless obstacles existing only to delay the protagonists. Here, Jimmy is observant, patient, and unexpectedly likable. His interactions with Scott often play like a polite game of chess, with both men attempting to appear completely ordinary while quietly suspecting far more than they admit. The humor comes from restraint rather than exaggeration, making every inspection of Scott's home feel strangely suspenseful despite the absence of explosions or superpowers. The second pursuing force is far less restrained. Sonny Birch refuses to accept losing access to Hank Pym's revolutionary technology, transforming his criminal operation into a relentless source of pressure. Unlike Ghost, Sonny rarely understands the deeper scientific implications of what he seeks. He recognizes only extraordinary financial value. That motivation makes him dangerous in a distinctly human way. Greed has always fueled countless crime stories, and placing it beside quantum physics creates an entertaining collision between ordinary criminal ambition and impossible scientific invention. Then there is Ghost, whose motivations remain deliberately elusive. She is neither interested in profit nor concerned with legal authority. Her relentless pursuit feels intensely personal, suggesting that whatever she seeks extends beyond simple acquisition. Because her objectives remain partially hidden, every appearance carries an unsettling unpredictability. The audience understands what Scott, Hope, and Hank want. Ghost continues operating according to rules no one else has fully deciphered. This constant pressure keeps the story in perpetual motion. The protagonists rarely enjoy the luxury of planning several steps ahead because another faction inevitably interrupts before any strategy can fully unfold. It is remarkable how naturally the screenplay sustains this momentum. Rather than relying on repetitive action scenes, it allows competing agendas to generate conflict organically. Every victory immediately attracts another problem, creating the feeling that the heroes are always one decision away from losing everything. Seeking answers that Hank cannot uncover alone, the team turns toward an unexpected figure from his past, Dr. Bill Foster. His introduction quietly expands the scientific history of the Marvel Cinematic Universe while enriching Hank's own character. Bill is not presented as a rival obsessed with revenge, nor as a mentor waiting to rescue the heroes. Instead, he represents another brilliant mind whose complicated history with Hank reflects the reality that extraordinary collaboration often produces equally extraordinary disagreements. The scenes between Michael Douglas and Lawrence Fishburne carry an understated warmth beneath years of professional tension. Their conversations reveal mutual respect buried beneath lingering pride, allowing audiences to imagine decades of shared discoveries and equally memorable arguments. Small exchanges about past experiments and scientific achievements communicate far more than lengthy exposition ever could. Even a playful debate regarding who truly achieved the greatest growth experiment hints at lives extending well beyond the immediate plot, rewarding attentive viewers with subtle world building. Bill's expertise also helps shift the mystery surrounding Ghost away from simple confrontation and toward understanding. As pieces of the puzzle begin fitting together, the audience discovers that Ghost is not merely a masked thief with unusual abilities. Ava Starr is living through a relentless molecular instability that causes her body to phase uncontrollably between physical states. What initially appeared to be an extraordinary superpower gradually reveals itself as a painful medical condition. Before the emotional depth of that revelation fully settles, however, the film reminds us that Scott Lang remains Scott Lang. His suit begins malfunctioning at exactly the worst possible moments, producing one of the sequel's most inspired comedic ideas. Instead of granting complete control over size, the damaged regulator traps Scott at unpredictable scales, turning his greatest advantage into a wonderfully unreliable liability. The elementary school sequence perfectly captures the franchise's unique personality. Scott becomes trapped at the size of a small child while attempting to avoid detection inside a crowded school. The image is immediately hilarious because it combines superhero absurdity with painfully familiar social anxiety. He is still an adult, still responsible for saving the day, yet every visual cue suggests he belongs among the students surrounding him. The comedy emerges not from mocking the character but from watching an intelligent hero navigate an impossibly awkward situation with whatever dignity he can preserve. Peyton Reed stages the sequence with remarkable precision. The shrinking effect is not simply a visual joke repeated several times. It influences camera placement, pacing, and physical performance. Paul Rudd subtly adjusts Scott's posture, facial expressions, and nervous confidence to match the bizarre circumstances, allowing the audience to believe both the comedy and the urgency simultaneously. Even while laughing, viewers never forget that Scott's malfunction threatens the entire mission. These moments of levity perform an important dramatic function. By allowing the audience to laugh in the middle of escalating danger, the film avoids emotional monotony. Comedy does not interrupt the suspense, it sharpens it by making the characters feel more human. Scott's willingness to improvise despite constant embarrassment reinforces one of his defining qualities. He is not fearless because he never fails. He is courageous because he continues moving forward after every failure. As Bill Foster reveals more about Ava's condition, the emotional balance of the story quietly shifts. Ghost is no longer framed as an obstacle standing between the heroes and their objective. She becomes another victim of circumstances beyond her control. Years of molecular instability have left her in constant pain, forcing her to pursue increasingly desperate solutions simply to survive. Her actions remain dangerous, but they become understandable in ways that fundamentally change how the audience interprets every confrontation. That transformation is one of Ant-Man and the Wasp's most mature storytelling choices. Rather than reducing conflict to heroes defeating villains, the film recognizes that opposing sides can share understandable motivations while still remaining incompatible. Everyone is racing against time. Everyone believes they are protecting something precious. The difference lies not in the sincerity of their goals but in the paths they are willing to take. By weaving together escalating pursuit, inventive comedy, and unexpected compassion, the rising action deepens both the excitement and the emotional complexity, proving that this adventure grows richer every time its characters are forced to see one another as people instead of obstacles. Every great caper eventually reaches the moment when careful planning collapses under the weight of too many moving pieces. Ant-Man and the Wasp arrives at that point with remarkable precision. Until now, the heroes have managed to stay one step ahead through quick thinking, inventive technology, and a little luck. But the deeper they move into their mission, the more obvious it becomes that clever improvisation alone cannot solve every problem. The midpoint is where momentum turns into pressure, and pressure begins demanding sacrifice. The most immediate blow comes with the loss of control. Hank Pym's portable laboratory, the heart of the entire rescue operation, no longer remains safely in the hands of its creators. Whether through Sonny Birch's relentless pursuit, Ghost's desperate intervention, or the constant collisions between competing factions, the technology everyone has been chasing slips beyond the hero's grasp. It is a subtle but significant shift. Earlier, the team dictated the direction of events. Now they are reacting to circumstances created by others. Because the laboratory contains the quantum tunnel itself, losing it means far more than surrendering valuable equipment. Every scientific breakthrough, every calculation, and every remaining opportunity to reach Janet Van Dyne depends on that machine. The MacGuffin suddenly transforms into a ticking clock. Ownership of the technology constantly changes, but time continues moving in only one direction. Peyton Reed deserves particular credit for how clearly the audience understands these shifting objectives. Despite multiple factions competing simultaneously, the narrative never becomes confusing. Every chase carries immediate purpose because viewers always know what is at stake for each participant. Sonny wants the laboratory because he sees extraordinary profit. Ghost believes it may hold the key to ending years of unbearable suffering. Hank and Hope need it to save Janet before their final opportunity disappears forever. The object remains the same, yet its meaning changes depending on whose hands reach for it. That growing urgency is reinforced by Hank himself. Throughout the earlier portions of the film, Michael Douglas plays the scientist with familiar confidence, masking concern behind impatience and dry humor. As the rescue mission becomes increasingly uncertain, however, cracks begin appearing beneath that composed exterior. The emotional burden of waiting decades to find Janet begins catching up with him. His determination never weakens, but his exhaustion becomes increasingly visible. Hank's declining condition serves an important narrative purpose beyond physical vulnerability. It reminds the audience that this mission has never been purely scientific. Every setback forces him to relive the moment he lost Janet, carrying decades of unresolved grief into every failed attempt. His obsession is understandable because hope can become painfully difficult to abandon once it has survived for so many years. The possibility of reaching Janet again has sustained him through countless disappointments, making the thought of losing that chance almost unbearable. As if the rescue itself were not difficult enough, Scott faces an entirely different countdown. His period of house arrest is nearly complete, and every successful day brings him closer to freedom. Yet every minute spent helping Hank and Hope increases the possibility that federal authorities will discover he has repeatedly violated the strict conditions of his sentence. The film cleverly places two ticking clocks beside one another. One measures the shrinking opportunity to rescue Janet. The other measures the shrinking distance between Scott and another devastating prison sentence. That conflict reaches its most entertaining and nerve-wracking expression during the unexpected FBI inspection. Agent Jimmy Woo arrives prepared for another routine visit, completely unaware that Scott is nowhere near where he is legally required to be. What follows is a masterclass in comedic suspense. Rather than depending on spectacular action, the sequence builds tension from timing, coordination, and increasingly impossible logistics. The heroes scramble to return Scott home before Jimmy notices anything unusual, turning suburban streets into the setting for a race every bit as exciting as the earlier chase scenes. The audience laughs because the situation grows increasingly absurd, but beneath the comedy lies genuine consequence. Unlike many superhero disguises that exist only for visual spectacle, Scott's deception carries immediate legal risk. One mistake would not simply end the mission. It would destroy the ordinary future he has spent years trying to rebuild. Jimmy Woo unknowingly becomes the perfect obstacle. His professionalism prevents him from appearing foolish, while his polite persistence makes every passing second more uncomfortable for Scott. The humor comes from watching ordinary procedures collide with extraordinary circumstances. There are no alien invasions, no collapsing buildings, and no armies filling the skyline. Instead, suspense emerges from whether one exhausted father can sit inside his own living room before a federal officer realizes something is wrong. This sequence also highlights one of the film's defining strengths: its refusal to separate superhero spectacle from everyday life. Scott is not only trying to save someone trapped beyond reality. He is also trying to avoid disappointing his daughter, losing his business, and returning to prison. Those ordinary consequences make his extraordinary adventures feel surprisingly relatable. Yet beneath the frantic comedy, Scott undergoes one of the story's most important emotional transformations. Until now, he has understandably tried to balance responsibility with self-preservation. He wants to help Hank and Hope, but he also wants to finish probation, remain present for Cassie, and finally leave his legal troubles behind. Those goals seem compatible only as long as circumstances remain manageable. The midpoint proves they no longer are. Every new complication forces Scott toward an uncomfortable realization. There is no version of this story where everyone remains completely safe. Choosing personal security now would almost certainly condemn Janet to remain trapped forever and leave Hank carrying another unbearable loss. Walking away might protect Scott's future, but it would betray the very qualities that made him worthy of becoming Ant-Man in the first place. What makes this decision compelling is that Scott gains nothing personally from making it. There is no promise of recognition, no guarantee of success, and certainly no assurance that the law will reward his sacrifice. Helping Hank and Hope actively increases the risk of losing everything he has rebuilt. That is precisely why the choice matters. Heroism becomes meaningful only when it demands something valuable in return. By the end of the midpoint, Ant-Man and the Wasp has quietly shifted from an entertaining chase into a story about competing responsibilities. The stolen laboratory symbolizes fading opportunity, Hank's worsening condition embodies decades of unresolved love, and Scott's impossible balancing act forces him to redefine what responsibility truly means. Faced with the choice between protecting himself and standing beside the people who need him most, Scott finally understands that being a hero is not about avoiding consequences. It is about accepting them when someone else's future depends on the decision you make. The final act of Ant-Man and the Wasp feels like the natural payoff to every idea the film has been quietly developing since its opening minutes. Rather than abandoning its identity in favor of an oversized battle, it doubles down on movement, ingenuity, and controlled chaos. Every character is still pursuing the same objective, but now every pursuit converges across the streets of San Francisco. The result is one of the Marvel Cinematic Universe's most inventive action sequences, proving that creativity can generate just as much excitement as sheer scale. The chase unfolds with the precision of an elaborate clockwork mechanism. Heroes, criminals, and Ghost continuously trade possession of the portable laboratory, while vehicles weave through crowded streets in a constantly shifting race. Unlike traditional superhero climaxes that often narrow into a single duel, this sequence becomes larger by growing more complicated. Every turn introduces another obstacle, another interruption, or another unexpected reversal. The audience is never entirely certain who will emerge with the advantage because the balance changes almost every minute. Peyton Reed transforms San Francisco into an enormous playground for visual storytelling. Size is no longer merely an effect but the central engine of the action. Cars expand and shrink in the middle of traffic. A harmless-looking Hot Wheels collection suddenly becomes a fleet of functioning escape vehicles. A giant PEZ dispenser crashes into the pursuit, serving as both visual punchline and tactical distraction. Each moment feels surprising because the film consistently applies its own rules in imaginative ways. The audience laughs not because the action lacks danger, but because the solutions remain wonderfully unpredictable. This careful relationship between comedy and suspense defines the entire climax. Every joke grows directly from the mechanics of shrinking technology rather than interrupting the narrative. Humor becomes another tactical weapon. The shrinking and enlarging devices are never random conveniences. They are integrated into every decision, forcing characters to think creatively instead of relying on overwhelming force. The action rewards intelligence and adaptability far more than physical dominance. Scott's transformation into Giant Man provides another perfect example of this philosophy. Growing to enormous size is visually spectacular, but the film never pretends the ability is effortless. Every use carries visible physical consequences. As Scott wades through the waters surrounding the bay, lifting vehicles and attempting to prevent catastrophe, Paul Rudd's performance emphasizes exhaustion as much as heroism. Giant Man is not presented as an unstoppable giant. He is a man pushing his body beyond its limits because there is simply no one else available to do what must be done. That vulnerability makes the spectacle feel surprisingly intimate. The audience admires Scott not because he appears invincible, but because he continues despite obvious strain. It reinforces one of the franchise's central themes: extraordinary courage often belongs to remarkably ordinary people. While chaos unfolds across the city above, the emotional center of the film moves somewhere far stranger. Hank Pym finally enters the quantum realm himself, stepping into a landscape that feels unlike any previous location in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Rather than resembling a hostile alien world, the environment appears almost dreamlike. Colors drift across impossible horizons, familiar concepts of distance lose meaning, and reality itself seems fluid. The visuals communicate wonder instead of fear, suggesting that this microscopic universe obeys laws beyond conventional human understanding. The decision to keep the rescue focused on Hank is deeply meaningful. For decades he has carried the guilt of believing he left Janet behind. Every scientific breakthrough, every sacrifice, and every obsessive experiment has been driven by the hope that she survived. When he finally finds her, the reunion deliberately avoids melodrama. Michael Douglas and Michelle Pfeiffer allow quiet recognition to carry the emotional weight. Years of separation are communicated through expressions more than speeches, making the moment feel earned rather than manufactured. Janet's survival also subtly transforms the mythology of the quantum realm. She has not simply endured this impossible environment. She has adapted to it. Her calm presence suggests that the realm is more than an endless void, it is a place capable of changing those who enter it. The film wisely leaves many questions unanswered, preserving a sense of mystery while hinting that Janet now understands realities beyond ordinary human perception. That restraint makes the world feel larger precisely because it refuses to explain everything. Back in the familiar world, the emotional conflicts reach their own resolution. Ghost, revealed fully as Ava Starr rather than an anonymous adversary, is no longer treated as an enemy who must be defeated. She is someone who has spent her entire life enduring unbearable instability. The heroes recognize that defeating her would solve nothing because her greatest battle has always been against her own condition. Janet's response becomes one of the film's most compassionate moments. Instead of using her remarkable quantum abilities as weapons, she uses them to heal. The act reflects the entire philosophy of Ant-Man and the Wasp. Scientific discovery achieves its highest purpose not when it creates greater power, but when it relieves suffering. Ghost's pain does not disappear completely, yet she is finally offered hope rather than endless survival. It is a resolution built on empathy instead of conquest, perfectly matching the story's emphasis on family, understanding, and second chances. For a brief moment, everything appears complete. Scott has honored both his friendships and his conscience. Hank and Janet are reunited after decades apart. Hope finally regains the family she thought was lost forever. Ghost receives the possibility of a future. Even the playful tone that has defined the film remains intact, allowing audiences to leave with genuine optimism. Then Marvel delivers one of the most devastating tonal reversals in its history. The mid-credits scene begins almost casually. Scott prepares to re-enter the quantum realm, collecting healing quantum energy that may continue helping Ava recover. Hank, Janet, and Hope monitor the mission from the control station with relaxed confidence. The atmosphere feels reassuring, as though the adventure has truly ended. And then silence. One by one, they vanish into drifting ash. Scott, trapped inside the quantum realm, hears only static where familiar voices once answered. Without explanation, without warning, the optimism built throughout the film collapses in an instant. The snap from Infinity War, absent throughout the main narrative, finally reaches these characters with terrifying inevitability. What once felt like a comfortably self-contained adventure is suddenly revealed to have been unfolding beside the darkest event in the MCU. It is a breathtaking ending because it never invalidates the joy that came before it. Instead, it reframes it. Ant-Man and the Wasp remains a story about family, hope, and human connection, but its closing moments remind us that even the smallest stories exist within a larger universe shaped by unimaginable consequences. The film begins by escaping Infinity War's shadow, only to end by stepping directly into it, leaving one ordinary man stranded between realities while unknowingly holding the key to everything that comes next. At the center of Ant-Man and the Wasp is a partnership built on contrast. Scott Lang and Hope Van Dyne could not approach heroism in more different ways, yet that difference is exactly what makes them effective together. In a cinematic universe filled with geniuses, kings, soldiers, and beings with extraordinary abilities, their greatest strength is not that they are the most powerful people in the room. It is that they represent two completely different philosophies of problem solving. Scott survives through empathy and improvisation. Hope succeeds through preparation and precision. One adapts to chaos. The other prevents chaos from happening in the first place. Scott Lang remains one of the most unusual protagonists in the Marvel Cinematic Universe because his identity is built around something refreshingly ordinary. He is not motivated by fame, influence, or the desire to create a legendary legacy. Unlike heroes whose journeys are shaped by personal ambition or a responsibility inherited from greatness, Scott's motivation begins and ends with family. His greatest fear is not failure on a global scale. It is failing the people closest to him, especially his daughter Cassie. That distinction makes Scott an almost anti-billionaire hero within the Marvel landscape. He does not have unlimited resources, a technological empire, or a carefully designed vision for changing the world. He does not enter every situation believing he is the smartest person present. In fact, Scott's willingness to admit uncertainty is one of his defining qualities. He understands when he is outmatched, and instead of allowing that weakness to become paralysis, he uses creativity to find another path forward. His intelligence is emotional rather than purely technical. Scott reads people well. He understands what others need to hear, when someone is hiding pain, and how to create cooperation between personalities that might otherwise clash. That ability often appears beneath his comedic personality, but it is arguably his greatest heroic trait. He does not unite people by commanding them. He connects with them by treating them like human beings. This quality separates Scott from many traditional superhero archetypes. His humor is not simply a source of entertainment. It is a survival mechanism. When situations become overwhelming, Scott uses optimism to keep moving. He jokes because fear does not help him solve problems. He improvises because perfect plans rarely exist. His approach may appear chaotic compared to Hope's disciplined methods, but his unpredictability often becomes an advantage. In a world where everyone expects heroes to behave according to established rules, Scott succeeds because he constantly finds solutions no one else considered. Hope Van Dyne represents the opposite side of that equation. Where Scott enters danger through instinct, Hope enters through preparation. Her entire life has been shaped by discipline, training, and the pursuit of control. Raised by Hank Pym, she inherited not only his scientific brilliance but also his emotional defenses. She learned to protect herself by becoming capable enough that she would never need to depend on anyone else. That strength is admirable, but it also reveals the emotional walls she has spent years building. As the Wasp, Hope finally steps beyond being the person waiting for recognition. Her journey throughout the film is not about proving she is capable. Everyone around her already knows she is capable. Her challenge is accepting that vulnerability does not diminish strength. For years, she has carried the pain of losing her mother and the frustration of feeling separated from the family she wanted to rebuild. Becoming the Wasp allows her to honor Janet's legacy while creating an identity that belongs entirely to herself. The significance of Hope inheriting her mother's mantle goes beyond receiving a superhero suit. The Wasp name represents a connection between generations of women whose intelligence and courage shaped the Pym legacy. Yet Hope does not simply become a replacement for Janet. The film allows her to carry that history while maintaining her own personality. She is not defined by who her mother was or who her father expects her to be. She earns the role through her own choices. Evangeline Lilly's performance captures that complexity through restraint. Hope rarely expresses emotion as openly as Scott does, but the absence of obvious vulnerability does not mean the emotion is missing. It exists beneath every controlled response and every carefully calculated decision. Her determination to rescue Janet is not merely a mission objective. It represents decades of unresolved grief and the possibility of healing a wound that has shaped her entire life. This emotional difference creates the foundation of Scott and Hope's partnership. At first, they seem almost incompatible. Hope views Scott as reckless, unreliable, and dangerously comfortable with improvisation. Scott sees Hope as overly serious, rigid, and unwilling to accept help. Their conflict works because neither perspective is completely wrong. Scott genuinely creates unnecessary risks. Hope genuinely struggles to recognize that uncertainty is sometimes unavoidable. The beauty of their relationship comes from how they gradually influence one another. Scott learns that preparation matters and that his actions affect people beyond himself. Hope learns that control has limits and that trusting others does not mean surrender.